Imagine a land of deserts and rivers, of ancient cities where people have lived for thousands of years. Now imagine that land under the control of a ruler whose words could make people cheer or tremble, whose power seemed absolute, and whose secrets were hidden deep behind high walls. This is Iraq in the 1980s and 1990s, a country caught between hope and fear. Saddam Hussein rose to power in Iraq in 1979. He became president with a firm hand, promising stability after years of unrest. At first, many Iraqis hoped he would bring order to their lives. Streets were cleaner, schools operated, and industries grew. But behind the smiles and speeches, there was a shadow. Saddam ruled with fear. Dissent was dangerous. People who disagreed with him could vanish overnight, never to be seen again. He built a network of spies and secret police, making sure everyone knew he was watching. Schools, workplaces, even neighborhood conversations were carefully monitored. Fear became a part of daily life. People learned to speak cautiously, to smile in public while hiding their worries inside. Yet, Saddam was also a master of power. He used oil money to modernize parts of Iraq. He built roads, hospitals, and large government buildings. He appeared to the world as a strong leader, someone who could command respect in a turbulent region. And for a time, Iraq seemed to have a place on the world stage. But Saddam's rise was not only about control at home, it was about ambition abroad. In 1980, Iraq went to war with neighboring Iran. This war lasted 8 long years, leaving hundreds of thousands dead on both sides. Cities were destroyed, families were torn apart, and yet Saddam stayed in power, using the war to strengthen his control at home, portraying himself as a defender of Iraq against foreign threats. When the war finally ended, Iraq was battered, and its people were weary. Saddam's rule became harsher. He tightened control, used violence to silence opponents, and built weapons programs that made the world nervous. Then came 1990. In a bold and dangerous move, Saddam invaded Kuwait. He claimed that Kuwait had been stealing oil from Iraq, but the invasion was widely condemned around the world. This action set off a chain of events that would change Iraq forever. The United States and a coalition of countries responded with a military campaign called the Gulf War in 1991. Iraq was defeated and Kuwait was liberated. Yet Saddam remained in power, retreating behind the walls of Baghdad and his fearsome security system. The war left Iraq with economic sanctions, restrictions that made it hard for ordinary people to get food, medicine, and other basic necessities. Children suffered from disease and hunger. Hospitals struggled to function. And throughout it all, Saddam stayed in control, projecting strength while his people endured hardship. By the late 1990s, Iraq was a country struggling. Its infrastructure was damaged, its people were weary. And Saddam, still in power, faced the growing pressure of the international community. The world accused him of hiding weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons that could cause massive destruction. Despite inspections and negotiations, doubts remained. The United Nations passed resolutions demanding that Iraq allow inspections and disarmament. Saddam, ever coming, allowed some inspections while secretly avoiding full disclosure. It was a tense game, a standoff between a powerful dictator and the international community, with the lives of millions hanging in the balance. Imagine watching a game of shadows, where every move is measured, and the stakes are the lives of millions. This is what the world saw in Iraq, a leader whose power seemed untouchable, yet whose choices made the entire region nervous. By the early 2000s, the United States and its allies were closely watching Iraq. Leaders worried that Saddam's weapons programs, combined with his unpredictable nature, could threaten global security. Intelligence reports suggested that Iraq might still be developing dangerous weapons. Some claimed that Saddam was hiding chemical or biological weapons, capable of harming thousands or even millions. For many, the question was urgent. Could the world wait any longer? Could Saddam be trusted to comply with inspections, or would he use these weapons to threaten neighbors or even the United States? The memories of 9/11 in 2001 added urgency to these questions. The attacks had shaken the world, and the U.S. government vowed to prevent further terrorist threats. Iraq, with its secretive government and history of aggression, seemed like a possible danger. Diplomatic talks began, inspections continued. Weapons inspectors from the United Nations went to Iraq, searching military sites, laboratories, and storage facilities. They asked questions, they examined facilities, they reported what they saw, and sometimes what they didn't see. Some inspectors found evidence of destroyed weapons or programs that were no longer active. Others warned that Saddam might be hiding things, that his regime was clever and unpredictable. Reports were often contradictory, and confusion grew in the media and among the public. Political debates heated up. Some world leaders argued that military action was necessary to prevent disaster. Others warned that invading Iraq could lead to instability, civilian suffering, and years of conflict. And then came the rhetoric. Leaders spoke of the threat posed by Saddam Hussein, of the danger of his weapons, of the need to act before it was too late. Newspapers, television, and radio covered every development. Citizens around the world watched, trying to understand a conflict that seemed distant yet deeply important. The stage was set. Iraq, a land of deserts, rivers, and ancient history, was about to face the storm of international attention. The world waited, wondering what would happen next, as a dictator prepared and nations debated how to respond. And so, as inspectors reported, politicians debated, and citizens watched, Iraq stood at the edge of a new chapter, a chapter that would change the Middle East and the world. Whispers turned into headlines, and everyone wondered, what is Saddam hiding, and what will the world do next? By late 2002, Iraq was on everyone's mind. After years of tension following the Gulf War, whispers about weapons of mass destruction were growing louder. The U.S. government, under President George W. Bush, claimed Saddam Hussein had hidden chemical and biological weapons. Some said it was a ticking bomb. Others said it was a political story to justify action. Families in Baghdad were uneasy. Children played in dusty streets, but parents were watching the news with nervous eyes. In cafes, debates buzzed. Will the U.S. invade? Is Saddam really dangerous? The uncertainty was everywhere. And across the globe, leaders debated. Diplomats wrote reports, and intelligence agencies scrambled to figure out the truth. The UN inspectors had been in Iraq for years checking on weapons programs. They reported back cautiously. Some inspectors suggested Iraq had destroyed most of its stockpiles years ago. Others said, "We can't be sure." The media ran headlines that fueled fear. Weapons of mass destruction found. Saddam's hidden arsenal. The stage was set. Meanwhile, ordinary Iraqis tried to live normal lives. Street vendors sold falafel and tea, kids went to school, and traffic jammed the streets of Baghdad. But there was an invisible tension in the air, a sense that something big was about to happen. In the U.S., Americans watched television screens filled with maps, military drills, and speeches. President Bush warned that Saddam Hussein posed a threat not just to the Middle East, but to the entire world. "We will act if we must," he said. Critics asked, "Are we rushing? Is this the right reason?" But the drumbeats of war were growing louder, and the world was listening. You can plan all you want, but when war is coming, life in every street, every home, every school feels different. By early 2003, the warnings became specific. The U.S. military began moving troops to the Persian Gulf, Ships, tanks, and planes were repositioned. Intelligence reports described weapons sites, military units, and possible targets. Analysts debated strategies, and Iraq prepared in its own way, mobilizing troops, setting up defensive positions, and preparing for what could come. Families faced hard choices. Some left the city for smaller towns or villages. Others stayed, believing Saddam would protect them. For children, the concept of war was abstract at first. They saw soldiers in uniforms and military vehicles rolling past schools, but the idea that their lives might change forever was something only adults could fully grasp. The world watched as diplomacy tried to hold the line. The UN called meetings, security councils debated resolutions. Saddam Hussein occasionally spoke to the press, declaring that Iraq had no forbidden weapons and accusing the U.S. of lying. Tension was like a tightly wound spring, ready to snap. And then, the spring snapped. Sometimes you can see a storm coming long before it hits, but knowing it's coming doesn't make it any less frightening. By early 2003, the world felt like it was holding its breath. Every headline, every news report, every statement from Washington seemed to point to the same question. Would the United States invade Iraq? And if so, when? Families in Baghdad, Mosul, and Basra were no longer just worried, they were anxious. The streets felt different. Even if the sun still rose over dusty rooftops and children still laughed on their way to school, there was a tension that could be felt in every marketplace, every cafe, every home. Governments across the world were weighing their options. In Europe, leaders called for caution, demanding more time for inspections and diplomacy. They asked, "Are we sure Saddam really has weapons of mass destruction? Can we act without proof?" But in Washington, the Bush administration seemed ready. They argued that waiting was too risky. If Saddam did have hidden weapons, they warned, he could use them or share them with terrorists. The clock was ticking, and the sense of urgency was building. Inside Iraq, Saddam Hussein remained defiant. He made public speeches, warning that Iraq would resist any invasion. Military parades displayed tanks and missile units. Soldiers marched in formation, and propaganda posters reminded citizens of the country's pride and power. But behind closed doors, not everyone was confident. Some advisors questioned whether Iraq could withstand a full-scale invasion by one of the world's strongest militaries. Families whispered about what might happen if war came to their neighborhoods. Meanwhile, in Washington and London, military planners worked on logistics that would make history. Maps covered the walls, models of Iraqi cities were laid out on tables, and commanders debated strategies. There were questions about how many troops would be needed, which bases to use, how to supply soldiers with food, water, and fuel. They practiced simulations, ran drills, and reviewed intelligence reports over and over. Every detail mattered because even a small mistake could cost lives. The media played a huge role in shaping public perception. Newspapers ran dramatic headlines. Television broadcasts showed maps with highlighted weapons sites and interviews with experts who claimed Saddam was hiding deadly chemical and biological weapons. Some of these reports were accurate, some were exaggerated, and some were outright wrong. But the effect was the same. The world seemed to be standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into uncertainty. And for ordinary Iraqis, life became a balancing act. Parents tried to keep routines, sending kids to school, preparing meals, and going to work. But every new report on television could make their hearts race. Bomb shelters were dusted off, emergency bags packed with food and water. People whispered about what would happen if airplanes flew over their cities, if missiles fell from the sky, if soldiers marched into the streets. Even the animals in the market seemed uneasy, as though they too sensed the coming chaos. Soldiers on both sides prepared quietly. In Iraq, conscripts and volunteers drilled, checked their weapons, and learned defensive maneuvers. They were told to expect airstrikes, to watch for enemy infiltrators, and to protect civilians where possible. For some, it was a patriotic duty. For others, it was a terrifying reality. Meanwhile, in the United States, young men and women trained in deserts, forests, and simulated Iraqi towns. They practiced convoy movements, urban warfare, and evacuation drills. Some had never been to the Middle East, but they were told to prepare for everything: hostile cities, roadside bombs, and an enemy who knew the land better than they ever could. The United Nations continued its inspections. Weapons experts moved through Iraq, checking old factories, missile sites, and research labs. They sometimes found traces of banned materials, but many times they found nothing. Frustration grew among inspectors, and tension grew between nations. Diplomats debated, could Iraq be forced to fully comply? Could inspections prevent war, or was war inevitable? And in the midst of this, journalists tried to tell the stories of real people. One reporter in Baghdad wrote about a teacher who still opened her classroom, even though her students worried about bombings. Another described a shopkeeper who stocked up on flour and rice just in case supply lines were disrupted. These small human stories were the undercurrent beneath the headlines of politics and military strategy. They reminded the world that the people who would suffer the most had done nothing wrong. And then came the final warning signs. Satellites picked up unusual troop movements in southern Iraq. Intelligence reports suggested that Saddam's forces were preparing for battle. Refugees began moving toward borders with Jordan and Syria. Families debated whether to leave or stay. The tension in the air was palpable. Even in cafes, conversations stopped whenever airplanes flew overhead. Every passing truck, every convoy, every whispered rumor could be a sign of the coming storm. It's one thing to hear about war in a faraway country. It's another to feel it creeping closer, like a shadow over your own backyard. By March 2003, the countdown was unmistakable. President Bush addressed the nation, warning Saddam that time was running out. The world watched as U.S. forces in the Persian Gulf took final positions. Troops from Britain, Australia, and other allies joined the preparations. Military ships sailed closer to Iraq's shores, helicopters were ready to lift, and tanks rumbled into position. Diplomacy was still alive on paper, but on the ground, action was imminent. Ordinary Iraqis tried to maintain normal life, but the reality was unavoidable. Schools adjusted schedules, markets stocked extra supplies, and families packed emergency kits. Children asked questions that parents struggled to answer. Some parents told their kids, "Don't worry, it will be okay," though they didn't fully believe it themselves. The streets of Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul were crowded with people trying to go about daily life, but fear was in the air, like dust. Meanwhile, military planners in Washington ran final simulations. What if the invasion is faster than expected? What if civilians are caught in crossfire? How do we minimize casualties while still accomplishing our goals? Every possible scenario was considered. Soldiers packed and checked gear. Pilots reviewed flight plans. Intelligence analysts scoured satellite images and intercepted communications. The gears of war were turning, and there was no turning back. And then, on March 20th, 2003, the moment arrived. At night, U.S. and coalition forces launched airstrikes on Baghdad and other major cities. The first explosions lit up the sky. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, and sirens wailed through the streets. Soldiers moved into position. tanks rolled, and helicopters soared above the city. Families huddled in basements and shelters. Some prayed, some cried, and some held each other tightly. Children who had only heard about war in stories and on the news now saw its reality unfold above them. The invasion had begun, and Iraq's long period of tension erupted into open conflict. When the night sky suddenly glows red and the ground shakes beneath your feet, you realize war isn't just news, it's a new reality. The early hours of March 20th, 2003 were unlike any Iraqis had ever known. The hum of traffic and the chatter of markets were replaced by a different sound, a deep echoing roar of airplanes above. Explosions lit the horizon in Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul. Families woke to the shaking of buildings and the flash of distant fire. Windows rattled, dogs barked frantically, and children, some barely old enough to understand, clung to their parents in confusion and fear. In the skies above Iraq, stealth bombers and fighter jets began their carefully planned sorties. Targets were chosen to disable the Iraqi military's ability to respond. Airfields, command centers, radar stations, and communication hubs. On the ground, soldiers braced for the chaos that would inevitably follow. Coalition forces used the latest in precision-guided weaponry, hoping to minimize civilian casualties. But even with careful planning, the fear was tangible. Every flash in the sky, every distant boom, made people wonder whether the next moment would change their lives forever. At the same time, ordinary Iraqis experienced a world turned upside down. Shopkeepers abandoned their stalls mid-sale, mothers gathered children and hurried to basements, and teenagers whispered prayers for their fathers and brothers who were away at checkpoints or in the army. In hospitals, nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, preparing for injuries they could barely imagine. Power outages began to ripple through neighborhoods, and communication lines faltered under the sudden strain of chaos. The invasion was not just military, it was psychological. The suddenness of the strikes sent shockwaves through communities. Rumors and misinformation spread quickly. Is Baghdad being bombed? Is it over already? Where will the soldiers come next? Families huddled together in the dark, unsure if they should flee or stay. Fear and uncertainty became a new kind of routine, one that no child should ever have to understand. Meanwhile, coalition forces moved with remarkable coordination. Airstrikes were followed by the advance of ground troops. Tanks rolled forward. Convoys moved along the highways, and mechanized infantry secured strategic locations. Soldiers followed strict protocols to identify targets, avoid civilians, and maintain momentum. But in the fog of war, mistakes happened. Stray missiles, miscommunication, and unexpected ambushes reminded everyone that even the most carefully planned invasions carry enormous risks. War is not a movie. It doesn't pause between explosions. Every second matters, every decision matters, and every life matters. In Baghdad, the Iraqi military tried to mount a defense. Anti-aircraft guns fired into the night sky. Soldiers scrambled to secure key buildings, and armored divisions took positions at road junctions. But decades of sanctions, previous conflicts, and internal weaknesses made organized resistance difficult. Some units fought fiercely. Others retreated or surrendered, and many simply watched, unsure where the fighting would reach next. For the citizens, survival became the priority. Mothers tried to quiet their children while rationing water and food. Fathers looked for shelter for their families while worrying about their neighbors and extended family. Students and teachers abandoned schools. Markets closed. Streets, once filled with the vibrant sounds of commerce, became eerily quiet except for the intermittent roars of aircraft overhead. Even pets and animals seemed to sense the tension, hiding or shivering in the shadow of nearby buildings. The media coverage was intense. Cameras captured fiery explosions, streaks of tracer bullets, and plumes of smoke rising from Baghdad. Journalists embedded with soldiers reported from the front lines, describing what they saw, heard, and sometimes smelled. Back home in the United States and Europe, families watched the invasion on television, realizing that a story they had been reading about in newspapers had suddenly become vivid, immediate, and terrifying. On the ground, coalition forces faced logistical challenges. Roads were blocked or damaged, communication lines were inconsistent. Weather, sandstorms, and the unpredictable terrain of Iraq slowed some units. Yet the operation pressed forward. Helicopters ferried troops behind enemy lines. Reconnaissance teams scouted cities to avoid civilian areas. Precision-guided bombs and drones supported infantry movements. Every operation was a delicate balance between aggression and caution. The psychological impact on Iraqis was enormous. Children too young to fully grasp politics learned about war in terrifying ways. They saw the skies lit with fire, heard the rumble of bombs, and experienced the trembling of the earth. Families debated whether to flee the city despite rumors of checkpoints, roadblocks, and ambushes along the way. People clung to hope in small ways, preparing meals for neighbors, sharing water, praying together. In those moments, the humanity of daily life became a form of quiet resistance to the chaos outside. When the night sky suddenly glows red and the ground shakes beneath your feet, you realize war isn't just news, it's a new reality. The early hours of March 20th, 2003 were unlike any Iraqis had ever known. The hum of traffic and the chatter of markets were replaced by a different sound, a deep, echoing roar of airplanes above. Explosions lit the horizon in Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul. Families woke to the shaking of buildings and the flash of distant fire. Windows rattled, dogs barked frantically, and children, some barely old enough to understand, clung to their parents in confusion and fear. In the skies above Iraq, stealth bombers and fighter jets began their carefully planned sorties. Targets were chosen to disable the Iraqi military's ability to respond. Airfields, command centers, radar stations, and communication hubs. On the ground, soldiers braced for the chaos that would inevitably follow. Coalition forces used the latest in precision-guided weaponry, hoping to minimize civilian casualties. But even with careful planning, the fear was tangible. Every flash in the sky, every distant boom, made people wonder whether the next moment would change their lives forever. At the same time, ordinary Iraqis experienced a world turned upside down. Shopkeepers abandoned their stalls mid-sale. Mothers gathered children and hurried to basements. And teenagers whispered prayers for their fathers and brothers who were away at checkpoints or in the army. In hospitals, nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, preparing for injuries they could barely imagine. Power outages began to ripple through neighborhoods, and communication lines faltered under the sudden strain of chaos. The invasion was not just military, it was psychological. The suddenness of the strikes sent shockwaves through communities. Rumors and misinformation spread quickly. Is Baghdad being bombed? Is it over already? Where will the soldiers come next? Families huddled together in the dark, unsure if they should flee or stay. Fear and uncertainty became a new kind of routine, one that no child should ever have to understand. Meanwhile, coalition forces moved with remarkable coordination. Airstrikes were followed by the advance of ground troops. Tanks rolled forward. Convoys moved along the highways, and mechanized infantry secured strategic locations. Soldiers followed strict protocols to identify targets, avoid civilians, and maintain momentum. But in the fog of war, mistakes happened. Stray missiles, miscommunication, and unexpected ambushes reminded everyone that even the most carefully planned invasions carry enormous risks. War is not a movie. It doesn't pause between explosions. Every second matters, every decision matters, and every life matters. In Baghdad, the Iraqi military tried to mount a defense. Anti-aircraft guns fired into the night sky. Soldiers scrambled to secure key buildings, and armored divisions took positions at road junctions. But decades of sanctions, previous conflicts, and internal weaknesses made organized resistance difficult. Some units fought fiercely, others retreated or surrendered, and many simply watched, unsure where the fighting would reach next. For the citizens, survival became the priority. Mothers tried to quiet their children while rationing water and food. Fathers looked for shelter for their families while worrying about their neighbors and extended family. Students and teachers abandoned schools. Markets closed. Streets, once filled with the vibrant sounds of commerce, became eerily quiet except for the intermittent roars of aircraft overhead. Even pets and animals seemed to sense the tension, hiding or shivering in the shadow of nearby buildings. The media coverage was intense. Cameras captured fiery explosions, streaks of tracer bullets, and plumes of smoke rising from Baghdad. Journalists embedded with soldiers reported from the front lines, describing what they saw, heard, and sometimes smelled. Back home in the United States and Europe, families watched the invasion on television, realizing that a story they had been reading about in newspapers had suddenly become vivid, immediate, and terrifying. On the ground, coalition forces faced logistical challenges. Roads were blocked or damaged, communication lines were inconsistent. Weather, sandstorms, and the unpredictable terrain of Iraq slowed some units. Yet the operation pressed forward. Helicopters ferried troops behind enemy lines. Reconnaissance teams scouted cities to avoid civilian areas. Precision-guided bombs and drones supported infantry movements. Every operation was a delicate balance between aggression and caution. The psychological impact on Iraqis was enormous. Children too young to fully grasp politics learned about war in terrifying ways. They saw the skies lit with fire, heard the rumble of bombs, and experienced the trembling of the earth. Families debated whether to flee the city despite rumors of checkpoints, roadblocks, and ambushes along the way. People clung to hope in small ways, preparing meals for neighbors, sharing water, praying together. In those moments, the humanity of daily life became a form of quiet resistance to the chaos outside. Imagine living in a city where every street corner could be the last place you see your home, your friends, or even your family. By April 2003, Baghdad, Iraq's sprawling capital, was at the center of a storm that had been building for weeks. Outside the city, coalition forces were closing in, tanks rumbling over highways, helicopters sweeping the skies, and convoys of soldiers moving steadily forward. The Iraqi army, despite months of preparation, was stretched thin, morale faltering, and supplies running dangerously low. Inside the city, life had already changed drastically. Shops were shuttered, markets eerily quiet, and traffic snarled as families tried to flee. Electricity flickered in bursts. Water supplies were inconsistent. Radio and television broadcasts alternated between official government announcements, ominous news from the front, and public panic. Residents had learned to live with fear, to measure each sound, the distant boom of artillery, the low hum of helicopters, as signals of danger. Children, some too young to fully grasp politics or war, hid in basements or small rooms with their parents. They drew pictures of tanks and airplanes in crayons, trying to understand the chaos around them. Mothers tried to soothe their tears with whispered prayers. Fathers moved cautiously along streets, sometimes helping neighbors carry belongings, sometimes simply checking that everyone in their family was safe. Even pets seemed aware of the tension, cowering in corners or wandering the streets in confusion. Coalition forces aimed for a swift, decisive advance into the city. Airstrikes targeted strategic locations, communication centers, government buildings, and military posts. The strategy was precise, but the effect was terrifying. Windows shattered, walls crumbled, and fires broke out in residential neighborhoods. Smoke curled over the city like a dark cloud, carrying with it the smell of burning buildings, fuel, and rubble. When a city holds its breath, every explosion, every shout, every siren becomes a story of survival. Inside Baghdad, Iraqi forces struggled to maintain control. Some soldiers attempted to block advancing units at bridges and highways. Others retreated or abandoned positions altogether. Checkpoints, once heavily fortified, now had soldiers who were confused, outnumbered, or exhausted. Civilians noticed the shifts in power and sometimes helped guide troops, sometimes ran to avoid them. In this unpredictable environment, no one knew where safety could be found. Journalists captured the unfolding drama. Embedded reporters with coalition forces described the streets filled with abandoned cars, rubble, and scared families. Photographs showed tanks rolling past crumbling walls and children peering cautiously behind doors. For people watching worldwide, Baghdad had become a symbol of modern warfare, chaotic, fast-moving, and devastating to everyday life. As the invasion progressed, rumors spread through the city. Some people claimed that Saddam Hussein had fled. Others whispered that the regime would fight to the last man. Fear mingled with uncertainty, and simple daily decisions like whether to fetch water, buy bread, or leave home became life-and-death choices. Sometimes history doesn't arrive in headlines. It marches down streets, knocking on doors, and changing lives in a single day. The coalition's advance continued steadily. By mid-April, they were moving through Baghdad's outskirts, securing suburbs and major highways. The city was slowly encircled. Iraqi forces mounted sporadic resistance, but the pressure of a superior military and advanced technology made organized defense nearly impossible. On April 9, 2003, the world watched as Baghdad fell. Iconic moments were broadcast globally. Soldiers raising flags on government buildings, crowds celebrating in streets, and statues of Saddam Hussein being toppled. For many Iraqis, the fall of the regime was a surreal mix of fear, hope, and confusion. Some cheered, some cried, some hid, unsure what the future would hold. In the immediate aftermath, the city faced both celebration and chaos. Looting spread quickly through neighborhoods and stores as people scrambled for food, valuables, and basic necessities. Banks, businesses, and warehouses were stripped bare. Security was almost non-existent. Civilians tried to protect their families, but the sudden power vacuum made even ordinary life precarious. Coalition forces tried to restore order, but the task was enormous. Roads were blocked with debris, communications were down, and basic services were disrupted. Soldiers patrolled neighborhoods, coordinated relief efforts, and attempted to separate looters from peaceful citizens. Meanwhile, humanitarian organizations rushed to provide food, water, and medical assistance, though reaching everyone in need was nearly impossible. When a city celebrates victory, someone's tears are often hidden in the shadows. Amid the chaos, stories of bravery and kindness emerged. Neighbors protected each other from looters. Volunteers risked their safety to deliver medicine. Soldiers helped families move to safer areas, even in the midst of ongoing violence. Small acts of humanity became lifelines in a city that had been turned upside down. The political aftermath was equally complex. Saddam Hussein's government had collapsed, but no new Iraqi government was fully prepared to take control. Coalition forces established temporary administrative offices, trying to fill the gap and maintain essential services. Former officials were arrested or went into hiding, and political power struggles began to emerge almost immediately. For the Iraqi people, the fall of Baghdad did not instantly bring peace. While the dictatorship was gone, daily life was filled with uncertainty. Food shortages, disrupted schools, and damaged infrastructure made survival the immediate concern. Citizens navigated a city where explosions could still occur, where looters and opportunists roamed, and where the rules of daily life had shifted overnight. Internationally, the fall of Baghdad was a turning point. Headlines praised the swift military victory, but analysts warned that winning the war and winning the peace were different challenges. Questions arose. How would Iraq be rebuilt? How would citizens adjust to life without Saddam Hussein's strict control? And how could a country with deep ethnic, religious, and political divisions find stability? Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on streets. They're fought in hearts and minds. In the weeks after Baghdad's fall, coalition forces worked to stabilize key parts of the city, rebuild infrastructure, and support emerging local governments. Humanitarian aid was delivered, hospitals reopened, and schools began tentative operations. Yet the sense of insecurity lingered. Explosions, snipers, and sporadic attacks reminded everyone that even after a military victory, war's shadow remained. Iraqis faced the reality that liberation came with new challenges. Daily routines were disrupted, communities had to be rebuilt, and trust, both in foreign forces and local institutions, was fragile. People who had lived under a dictatorship were suddenly free, in theory, but in practice, survival, safety, and hope were uncertain. The fall of Baghdad marked the beginning of a broader conflict. While major combat operations had ended, insurgency, guerrilla attacks, and sectarian violence would rise in the coming months and years. The initial euphoria of liberation slowly gave way to the long-term struggle of nation-building, a process far more difficult than any military campaign. Victory is often loud, peace is often quiet, and sometimes the quiet is the hardest to achieve. For soldiers, the fall of Baghdad was a moment of achievement mixed with reflection. Many had trained for this operation for months, even years. They celebrated the completion of a mission, but quickly realized that their work was far from over. Securing cities, protecting civilians, and helping rebuild a nation was a task that would last long after the combat had ended. Imagine waking up in a city where every sound could be a warning. Every knock at the door, every car passing by might bring danger. After the fall of Baghdad, Iraq seemed at first to have a new beginning. The streets that had been filled with chaos and fear now held a cautious sense of hope. People returned to shops, schools tried to reopen, and families started to plan for life beyond dictatorship. But underneath this fragile calm, new dangers were quietly taking root. Coalition forces and newly appointed Iraqi leaders quickly realized that military victory did not mean peace. While major combat operations had succeeded, the foundations for stability were weak. Vacuums emerged, old rivalries reignited, and resentment toward foreign troops grew among certain communities. Some Iraqis felt relief at the fall of Saddam Hussein. Others saw their daily lives upended by occupation forces and uncertain governance. The insurgency began quietly, almost invisibly. Small groups formed, consisting of former regime loyalists, disaffected citizens, and extremists motivated by ideology or revenge. They operated in the shadows, launching sudden attacks that disrupted life across cities and towns. Roads became dangerous. Supply lines for essential goods were constantly threatened. Even walking to school or the market carried a risk. Sometimes the most powerful enemies are the ones you can't see coming. As insurgent attacks increased, coalition forces faced the challenge of protecting a population that was both relieved and wary. Patrols moved cautiously through neighborhoods. Checkpoints were set up at major intersections, yet attackers adapted quickly. Suicide bombings, roadside bombs, and ambushes became frequent. These were not just tactics of war, they were messages designed to show both Iraqis and foreign forces that control was fragile. Civilians were caught in the middle. Families who celebrated liberation one day were forced to hide the next. Children learned to recognize the whistling sound of a distant mortar shell or the low hum of an approaching convoy. Mothers and fathers struggled to explain why their streets were unsafe, why neighbors could suddenly disappear, or why curfews were suddenly enforced. The media captured both fear and resilience. Journalists reported from the front lines, often risking their lives. Images of burned-out cars, damaged buildings, and frightened civilians circulated worldwide, showing that even after Saddam Hussein's fall, Iraq remained deeply unstable. When a city is alive with both hope and fear, every day becomes a test of courage. At the same time, political divisions within Iraq became increasingly clear. Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish communities had long histories of tension. During Saddam's regime, power had been centralized, and these groups were often oppressed or marginalized. With the dictator gone, old grievances resurfaced. Some factions sought revenge for past injustices, while others pushed for greater political influence in the new Iraq. Coalition authorities tried to create a new government, organize elections, and establish democratic institutions. However, progress was slow. Corruption, inefficiency, and mistrust hampered efforts. Citizens often viewed new leaders with suspicion, seeing them as either too weak, too aligned with foreign powers, or unwilling to address long-standing inequalities. In the shadows of victory, a new battle quietly began, one that would test everyone's strength and patience. By mid-2003, insurgent activity had grown beyond small-scale attacks. Groups like al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by figures such as Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, began coordinating more sophisticated operations. Their goal was not just to fight foreign troops, but to destabilize the emerging Iraqi government, create fear among civilians, and push the country toward chaos. Improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, became the insurgents' signature weapon. Hidden along roads, in cars, or buried in the ground, these bombs could strike at any time. Convoys of coalition troops had to move slowly, carefully checking each street and roadside. Even with advanced technology and military training, soldiers were vulnerable. Casualties mounted, morale was challenged, and the public perception of security worsened. When danger is invisible, courage is measured in small steps. The insurgency was not uniform. Some attacks were politically motivated, targeting government buildings or officials. Others were aimed at foreign forces, creating headlines that drew attention and influenced international policy. Still others were indiscriminate, affecting neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals. Civilians who had hoped for a quick transition to peace now faced daily uncertainty. Complicating matters, militias formed along sectarian lines. Some Shia groups aligned with political parties or foreign allies, while Sunni factions felt marginalized and often joined or supported insurgent groups. Kurdish forces operated with relative autonomy in the north, pursuing their own political agendas. The result was a fragmented, unpredictable landscape of conflict where alliances shifted and violence could erupt anywhere. Coalition forces adapted by increasing patrols, conducting raids, and attempting to dismantle insurgent networks. Special operations units carried out targeted missions, while regular troops focused on maintaining security and rebuilding infrastructure. Despite these efforts, insurgents remained elusive, blending into civilian populations and using knowledge of the local terrain to their advantage. Fighting an enemy you cannot see is like chasing shadows in the dark. As insurgency grew, the Iraqi population faced a stark reality. Liberation had brought freedom from dictatorship, but not freedom from fear. Schools operated sporadically. Hospitals struggled to treat patients amid shortages and damage. Businesses reopened slowly, but looting, intimidation, and attacks made economic stability difficult. Daily life became a delicate balance between normalcy and survival. Families rationed food, monitored news updates, and relied on community networks to stay informed. Children adapted quickly, learning which streets were safe, how to respond to alarms, and when to stay indoors. Adults navigated a complex environment, sometimes negotiating with local militias or authorities to ensure safety, sometimes fleeing altogether. War doesn't end when the fighting stops, it lives in the choices people make every day. The occupation also faced criticism from international observers. While some praised efforts to rebuild Iraq, others questioned whether foreign troops understood the country's complex social and political realities. Missteps in governance, failure to prevent looting, and cultural misunderstandings fueled resentment among Iraqis. Recruitment for insurgent groups increased, and propaganda spread rapidly through local networks and emerging media channels. Efforts to stabilize Iraq included rebuilding infrastructure, re-establishing police forces, and supporting local governance. But progress was slow, and insurgents exploited every weakness. Checkpoints could be bypassed, patrols were attacked, and communities distrusted both coalition forces and local authorities. The sense of insecurity persisted, and hope for a peaceful future became fragile. Sometimes winning a battle is easy. The real challenge is keeping peace in its place. By 2004, insurgency had expanded into rural areas and smaller cities. The coalition's focus on urban areas left many regions lightly defended. Militants used this to their advantage, moving quickly between towns, disrupting supply routes, and demonstrating their reach. Civilians in these areas faced constant danger, with limited access to aid or protection. The political situation mirrored the military challenges. Iraq's new government struggled to assert authority. Elections were held, but voter turnout was uneven. Political parties vied for influence, sometimes prioritizing sectarian interests over national unity. Corruption and inefficiency undermined efforts to rebuild public trust. Building a nation is not just about walls and roads, it's about hearts and minds. Amid the turmoil, stories of resilience continued to emerge. Teachers opened schools in basements or tents. Doctors treated patients in makeshift clinics. Volunteers delivered water, food, and medicine despite danger. These quiet acts of courage reminded everyone that even in the darkest times, humanity persisted. Coalition forces increasingly relied on counterinsurgency strategies, which emphasized protecting civilians, building local relationships, and understanding the cultural and social fabric of Iraqi communities. Success was uneven. Some programs reduced violence in specific neighborhoods, while others failed or unintentionally fueled resentment. By the end of 2004, it became clear that Iraq was entering a prolonged period of instability. The fall of Baghdad had only been the beginning. Insurgency, sectarian violence, and occupation challenges would dominate the next several years, shaping the country and the region in profound ways. Sometimes, history's loudest moments are not in victory parades, but in the quiet struggle of everyday life. For Iraqi civilians, the struggle to live safely, maintain hope, and rebuild their communities became a daily reality. Every family, every child, every street carried the legacy of the invasion, a legacy of opportunity, fear, resilience, and adaptation. What happens when the walls that held a nation together suddenly crumble? When coalition forces invaded Iraq in 2003, the world watched with anticipation. The goal was clear, or so it seemed: remove Saddam Hussein from power, find weapons of mass destruction, and bring freedom and democracy to the Iraqi people. But as the dictator's regime fell, a new reality quickly took shape, one that no map or military plan could fully predict. Iraq was a country divided, even before the invasion. Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish communities had lived under a delicate balance of power. Saddam's rule had maintained this balance through fear and control, suppressing uprisings and punishing dissent. When that central power disappeared, the divisions came rushing to the surface. Neighborhoods that had once coexisted peacefully now eyed each other with suspicion. Families found themselves questioning old friends and neighbors. Trust, once taken for granted, was suddenly a rare commodity. The early days after Saddam's fall were filled with uncertainty. Coalition forces tried to establish security and rebuild governance, but the vacuum left behind was bigger than anyone anticipated. Weapons caches, militias, and opportunistic groups multiplied, each vying for influence. Attacks that once targeted only the regime now targeted coalition soldiers, police officers, and civilians alike. Every street, every neighborhood had a story of fear. Some whispered quietly in homes, others screamed loudly through the echoes of explosions. It wasn't long before insurgency groups exploited the chaos. Suicide bombings, car bombs, and roadside attacks became daily realities. Schools, hospitals, and marketplaces were no longer safe spaces. Children learned to recognize the sound of an explosion before they could even read street signs. Families moved repeatedly, often living for weeks in temporary shelters or with relatives who could offer some semblance of safety. Each day was a gamble, and survival became an ever-present question. Yet, amid the danger, life continued. Small acts of normalcy, children playing soccer in a dusty street, families sharing meals, neighbors helping each other rebuild homes, provided fragile glimpses of resilience. The people of Iraq were adapting to a new reality, even as the world around them descended into chaos. Over 100,000 lives were directly impacted in ways no headline could capture. By 2006, the consequences of the invasion were clear and far-reaching. Sectarian violence had reached unprecedented levels. Neighborhoods were divided, trust eroded, and the simple act of leaving home carried risks. Schools struggled to function, hospitals were overwhelmed, and public services were nearly non-existent. Every explosion, every attack left both visible and invisible scars on the population. The political landscape also shifted dramatically. Militias that had formed during the occupation became powerful actors in Iraq's political system. Some maintained local security, offering protection in their communities. Others engaged in criminal activity or challenged the central government for influence. Corruption spread as officials exploited chaos for personal gain, further undermining public trust. Internationally, the war reshaped perceptions of power and strategy. The initial justification, the search for weapons of mass destruction, was proven false. This revelation shook confidence in intelligence and the planning of military interventions. Allies questioned the purpose of the war, resources were stretched thin, and the global reputation of the United States was affected. Lessons about intervention, nation-building, and diplomacy became urgent topics of discussion. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. Many more were wounded, carrying physical and emotional scars that would last a lifetime. Children grew up surrounded by fear. Families were displaced, and communities were permanently altered. Ordinary moments, walking to school, visiting a friend, celebrating a festival, were overshadowed by uncertainty and danger. And yet, amidst the chaos, stories of courage persisted. Teachers risked their lives to educate children. Doctors treated the wounded despite threats, and families found ways to maintain culture, tradition, and hope. These small acts of resilience became the backbone of Iraqi society, demonstrating that even in the darkest times, humanity persists. The rise of extremist groups like Al-Qaeda in Iraq highlighted the unintended consequences of occupation. These groups exploited instability and sectarian tension to gain control over territories, setting the stage for further conflict and the eventual emergence of ISIS. The cycle of violence, revenge, and fear continued, leaving future generations to navigate a landscape scarred by decades of war. At the same time, Iraq's story was a lesson for the world. Technology, firepower, and money alone could not rebuild a nation or win hearts and minds. Understanding culture, history, and social dynamics proved essential, yet difficult to implement amid ongoing conflict. The war demonstrated that interventions, no matter how well-intentioned, have consequences far beyond what anyone can predict. By the end of the U.S. combat mission in 2011, Iraq remained a nation in transition. Efforts to establish democracy and governance had yielded mixed results. Some regions stabilized, while others continued to experience violence. The people, however, endured. Communities rebuilt, children returned to schools, and daily life resumed, even under challenging circumstances. The legacy of the Iraq War was not only visible in the rubble of cities or the statistics of casualties, it was etched in the lives of millions. Ordinary Iraqis had lived through occupation, insurgency, and civil strife. Soldiers had faced repeated deployments, loss, and moral dilemmas. Both groups carried memories that could never be erased. Ultimately, the Iraq War was a story about people navigating extraordinary challenges. It was about resilience in the face of fear, courage amid chaos, and the persistence of hope even when the world seemed broken. And as Iraq looked toward the future, the lessons remained clear. Peace is fragile, trust is precious, and rebuilding a nation requires more than weapons and promises. It requires understanding, patience, and the unwavering spirit of its people.
Stories like these help us understand the world and the people living in it. If you want to uncover more history, explore untold stories, and see the world through new eyes, hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey. Don't miss what's coming next.